Do you see the synthesis view as in conflict at all with what social psychology might suggest is a better approach to organizing society? So, what I have in mind here is, on the one hand, the well confirmed phenomenon of in group bias, and on the other, the synthesis's reification of these very group identities, like with the segregation of classes that we mentioned at the beginning of our conversation.
Yeah, that's one of my fundamental concerns. So, one of the most impressive research programs in social psychology is intergroup contact theory. And what we've
Intergroup contact theory?
Yeah. So,
Okay.
What we found is that when people who are members of different groups have contact with each other, so with intergroup contact, that often has really positive effects. So, you can look at groups that have historically been very inimical to each other. And when members of them get to know each other better, they actually overcome many of the prejudices that they used to have. And this is a finding we've had in all kinds of different contexts between whites and African Americans in the United States, between Irish and Protestants in Northern Ireland, between Jews and Arabs in Israel. Lots and lots of different contexts we've seen successful examples of that. But what the research also shows quite clearly is that this happens primarily when four conditions are met. And broadly speaking, these conditions are that in that society, you should have, in that context, you should have equal status. You might not have equal status in society as a whole. One of these groups might be much more privileged than the other. But in the context in which the interaction takes place, you should have equal status. But you have to be pursuing a common goal that perhaps you're trying to win some sports tournament, or perhaps you're trying to fill in potholes in your neighborhood, or perhaps you're trying to do something where in that context, you're actually part of the same team. You're trying to do something together. And there's real encouragement from society around you to get on. People around you are saying, you should get on. If you're not, then we're worried about that, right? We want you to get on. If you're in a society that says conflict is good and you should distrust each other, then that's much more hard to make happen. And I do worry that a lot of the kind of institutional practices we've taken on in society go right against that. But these affinity groups are telling people you're not the same, you can't trust each other, you should be really scared of members of the other group that they have the capability to harm you tremendously, and it's perfectly natural that you might not get along. That goes against the fundamental insights of intergroup contact theory. It would be much better to put kids on a sports team together, where kids from different backgrounds have to cooperate in order to win. And then after they win the game or after they lose the game, they can have a conversation in the locker room or somewhere else where they also open up about their lives and can share with each other some of the experience they have in society that is discriminatory and so on. We shouldn't be blanking that out, but creating a context where we see each other as part of the same in-group, and we see each other as friends and comrades, and then can say, hey, you know what? I face these challenges and you're my friend, and I wish that you were sympathetic towards that. That's going to be much, much, much more productive than coming in and saying, you 7-year-old Hispanic kid, you go over there because you're fundamentally different from a 7-year-old white kid over there.
No, those problems also resonate with my experience, which I mean, intuitions can only get you so far, but it's good that it makes sense in the context of my life as well. But so we've just discussed some problems that the synthesis has for intergroup dynamics, but what consequences does adopting the synthesis have at the individual level? So, I mean, one problem that comes to mind is if you identify yourself or define yourself in this extremely narrow way, just based on these boxes you check off, and then restrict the ideas you will tolerate, the people you spend time with, and so on, your social life can become increasingly isolated. You're thinking very siloed, and we see that in the academic world big time. And then, I mean, this is pretty broad, but your impact on the world is going to be curtailed.
Yeah, I think it can lead you to be really sort of diffident and um, scared. It can lead to um, you know a hope of the feeling of equality, but a continual frustration of the feeling of equality. I have sort of two thoughts on this. I mean, one is I've talked a good bit about this to my friend Ibu Patel, who is sort of Muslim American. His parents immigrated from India. Um, and he described how he's a little older than me, growing up in Illinois and in the sort of late 70s and 80s. Um, he often felt very alone, right? And he often felt stereotyped, and he had experiences of discrimination and so on. And when he went to college, he really became attracted to the identity synthesis, to a kind of early version of it. It seemed to explain everything to him. And then he worked with an African American woman who was a theater professor, and she put on a play, and he went to see it. It was a talkback section. And he applied what he had learned in this ideology, which is he tried to take it down. He tried to look for ways in which it was somehow problematic or unjust. And he said, well, in this play, which was about sort of children and so on, the children have their own rooms. I mean, that is really deeply privileged. And how can you perpetuate these assumptions? There's lots of kids who don't have their own rooms. And the room became very awkward. And the talkback session sort of ended. And this woman who had put on this play, was a mentor of his, wrote him this email saying, look, thank you for your criticism. It's easy to criticize, it's hard to build. It's always easy to sit in judgment. If you think that I fell short, why don't you try and do better? And that grace that she extended to him in Ibu's mind really transformed how he operated, because he thought, I don't want to just be the guy sitting in the last row shouting what's wrong with something. I actually want to build something. And so I think one personal problem this can lead you to is to be like the younger Ibu rather than the slightly more mature Ibu. It's to go around finding fault with everything, pointing out how everything is terrible, without actually putting in the work to build something that is better, to build something that is more constructive. I think it's letting yourself be defined by the worst things that have happened to you rather than the things that perhaps are more naturally core of your identity. One thing that Ibu talks about is that he gets mad when his kids, very progressive teachers, ask him about, you're Muslim, what's it like? And they always want to put about like, you Muslim, you must have had all these experiences of discrimination. Tell us about what it's like to be a Muslim. And he was like, no, the content of my religion, I'm not religious myself, but the content of his religion is something that he thinks highly of, that he thinks is an important thing to share and so on. And he wishes the teachers encourage his sons to share. What do you believe in? What is your view of the world? What are Islamic values that you can share with the class, rather than, you're a Muslim that's going to be defined by the mostly or predominantly by the discrimination you experience. And the third sort of worry I have is just about what it takes to have social recognition, right? I think to feel seen in a society, it's hard when people say, you're X group, so you're terrible. So of course we have to fight against those forms of intolerance and discrimination. But I think ultimately we want to be seen as who we are. And we attempt to be seen as who we are by saying, but I have this mix of identities and that's what defines me. That's never going to adapt to who you are, because there's going to be other people who share the same mix of identities who are completely different from you. And part of that is always going to be a little bit patronizing, like, oh, like you're defined by these three intersecting sort of victimhood statuses that you have. I'm not going to be seeing you. I'm going to be seeing some kind of political abstraction and defining you, by the way, by some of the hardest things you have to face. But that's not you. You're something else. So one of the critiques of people who believe in this kind of ideology is, oh, they're all their own unique little snowflake, right? That's a kind of conservative phrase about this. I think we are all unique damn snowflakes. And I actually think the ideology doesn't allow people to be seen in the right sense as unique snowflakes. And so that's why I think of it as a personal trap, not just as a political trap for many people.
And another way that comes up in the book, but I don't think you've mentioned yet, in which the synthesis ends up being quite antithetical to its very own principles, is that in emphasizing racial, sexual, religious identity, etc., to achieve equality and a sense of belonging, it only ends up accentuating the isolation of another class of people. And that's those people who are on the margins of racial groups or social class and so on. So it really is, as I said, antithetical to that driving purpose of achieving equality.
Yeah, so this is another sort of, basic problem. We've been talking about Muslims for a while. Now, what if you're an Ismaili Muslim, which is a denomination of Islam that is heavily discriminated against in Pakistan and other places, but also among some Muslim Americans. And, there you're just seen as Muslim American, right? Like that is sort of the idea. But then within the Muslim community itself, you're also marginalized and discriminated against. And so if we have a conception of society in which, this collective belonging is the sort of most fundamental aspect of who you are, it's going to create all of these kind of problems where people are sort of seen as members of one group, but when the members of that group don't necessarily think of themselves as members, and that creates all kinds of problems. I mean, another thing that I talk about in the book, or briefly mentioned earlier, was sort of cultural appropriation. Now, this is brought home to me by the story of a former student of mine, who during the pandemic was asked by the director of the kind of university museum that she was interning in to recreate one of the works of art in the museum's collection. This is something that museums were doing at the time to sort of bring the collection to life at a time when people couldn't go see it in person. And so she chose the self-portrait of an Asian American artist, sort of an Asian artist and her mother, which was, a photograph which played with beauty standards and so on, made a kind of statement on what it is like to be a woman in the 21st century or something like that. And she recreated this picture with her own mother, who is a Chinese immigrant. And she submitted it, and the director of the museum said, "Oh, this is wonderful. This is great." But then the curator in charge wrote her this email denouncing her and saying, "How dare you do this? This is cultural appropriation. It is not for you to recreate this picture." And this former student of mine was confused and said, "I mean, my mother is Chinese. In the picture, it's my mother and me. How is this cultural appropriation?" But the student's father was not Asian. And in the mind of a curator, that somehow made her insufficiently pure, and I suppose insufficiently racially pure, to have the right to recreate the work of a fully Asian, non-mixed artist. That's an extreme example. This is something that happened at, an elite university in the United States in the year 2020. And it shows how easily this sort of need to draw boundaries between groups in order to serve some of these ideas can go really quite disturbingly wrong. And of course, the people who are going to be at the receiving end of that, again, are people whose membership in the group is not as clear or secure as that of others, right? If a student's parents had both been Chinese, she would have been okay in this context. But it's the fact that she's sort of, in the mind of a curator, at least a marginal member of a group, that put her at the receiving end of what to me is really quite a disturbing reaction.